Good morning, everyone. There will be a week when I come on and say, it was a real quiet week. It's not this week. And it's probably not going to be the next several weeks. We have a lot of stuff that's happening. I'm going to start off with the good things and then move into some of the new things that are coming up in the administration as they make changes, as well as talk about what's happening in Congress. Two main themes this week. First of all, when you push back, they're stepping back. So keep that in mind. And the second piece is when we have new crises that we're adding to the pile, it doesn't mean the old things we talked about are done. It means they're evolving. So we're in a moment where we're going to be talking about some new things this week, but it doesn't mean the things that we've talked about in other weeks are resolved. It means they are ongoing too. So I'm going to start with the good news and just emphasize to you how much your participation matters. Last week, we talked about the great testimony that the legislature heard about a bill that would have changed the amount of paperwork people needed to do to keep their Medicaid eligibility. And lots of people showed up at that hearing. I just want you to know that the moment that you spent in that hearing or the moment that you spent contacting your legislator by phone or by email carries forward and follows them. There were a ton of people who watched that testimony inside the building as it was happening. And I was in meeting with legislators this week, and several offices, one office said, yeah, they got an earful on that bill. Don't do that. And I was also in an office where it was a Republican member who really didn't have any idea what the bill did, but I came in and he asked me about it. And it turned out that he had heard directly from a young person in his district, anybody from Richland Center who has cerebral palsy. You made an impression on your legislator, and he was talking to me about it. He's like, yeah, I don't want anything to be harder for my constituent. This doesn't seem like a good idea. So I just want you to know that 2 weeks beyond when this hearing was, we had 3 articles come out about it. 2 of them are linked here. And the third one was in Wisconsin Health News, which is like the subscription publication for like the real health nerds. They covered this hearing. So lots of people watched it later. Lots of people watched it in the moment, and all of your contacts made a real impression. And the committee listened. There were 3 bills that were heard that day. 2 of them advanced this week. This is the only one that wasn't scheduled for an executive session, and it didn't advance. And as I heard back from several of you who let me know what your legislators were saying. There were several members on that committee who were responding to their constituents that they didn't support the bill and they weren't going to advance it. So that I think is a very direct relationship between they had a hearing, the public showed up and said the things that were real and true, and the legislators went, oh, maybe that isn't such a good idea. So it's really important as we keep going to remember these moments where you can really see that what you're doing has made a tremendous difference, because there are going to be a lot of moments where we're going to need to be contacting folks and letting them know what's going on. Another example of this, some of you may know Bobby Peterson with ABCs for Health. He was interviewed on Here and Now on PBS about Medicaid as a whole. So, many of the things that we've been talking about since January, he did a short segment, and they started the segment with several people who had testified about Medicaid at the recent joint finance hearings. So those joint finance hearings were covered and recorded by Wisconsin Eye. And who knew that you would end up being the B-roll that would be starting a news segment for a statewide program? But there you were, and they were ordinary people. Some of you said that you got calls from your friends and said, "Hey, I saw you on TV," and they didn't know that you had testified at Joint Finance, but there you were talking about it and introducing a segment that was totally on Medicaid. So again, you know, that moment in time, that 2 minutes before the Joint Finance Committee had an additional life beyond what when you stop speaking. Another important thing this week, some of you may remember this Lynn Breedlove, who used to be the executive director for Disability Rights Wisconsin, very active in the 1970s, 80s disability policy, and one of the grandfathers of, you know, our current family care, like what evolved into being family care in Iris today. He wrote an opinion piece that you could check out here that was pretty pointed about, you know, what the current proposals Congress has to cut Medicaid might mean for Wisconsin, and what it might be, you know, what would it be like if we lost some of the supports that, you know, are the foundation of our system today. So first group of asks for you, I won't call anybody here old, because we, you know, older adults are a valuable part of our community. So, and there's no negative connotation to age, but experienced people in Wisconsin. This is a reminder of how your memory can be really important and impactful now, because there are lots of folks, including many decision makers in Congress and the state legislature, who don't have that experience of what is it like to tell someone that they have all the need and all, you know, they every qualification, but they have to wait because there's simply no space to serve them. What does it mean to talk to a family who really needs help, either on the, you know, with an older adult, or maybe some of you are in the county system. You might remember when a lot more kids had to wait a lot longer before they could get into the children's long-term care program, and we still have some waiting lists for the children's program. Like, these are important experiences to really tell what that meant. What did it mean when people who needed care couldn't get it, or couldn't get what they need, or couldn't get enough of what they need? That is a really important reminder for folks. And some of our families may have that memory as well. If you had to wait to get into the children's system, you can kind of track, like, what is the value of early intervention, and what happens when people don't get it? For those of you who are working in health or long-term care, same ideas. What does it mean when people who need help can't get it on the schedule that makes the most difference? These are really important stories to tell right now. And certainly Lynn Breedlove told it in a very public way in a paper. We have a little link here. If you are interested in writing letters to the editor, this is a helpful resource to, you know, look at the major papers in Wisconsin and, you know, kind of click the link and go, okay, here's what their submission guidelines are. But I think getting those stories together, even if it's not a letter to the editor, if it's a note to your members of Congress, your 2 U.S. senators and your U.S. representative, or your state lawmaker, that can be a really valuable message to start sending now. Remember, Governor Walker was the person who ended the wait list, and that only happened in 2018. So it hasn't been that long. It's our recent memory where there were places in the state that, based on where you live, determined whether or not you were going to get care quickly if you needed long-term care. I wanted to share also one of the strategies that some of our grassroots in one of the congressional districts are using. There have been a lot of events that are happening. Some of them are really public, some of them are more closed and private. Some of you may be at the moment trying to organize and invite members of Congress. They're here this week and next week to events that you're hosting. And so this strategy this woman is using is to kind of get people to self-identify if they've been, if somebody they know has been touched by Medicaid. And it's a really powerful, I had a video in here and then Jeremy was like, the file's too big. But if you want the video, let us know and we can, try and set up a link to it. Really powerful way to kind of visually show how many people have some connection to Medicaid. And what she did is come up with some messaging strategy, kind of in a script, so to speak, before she does kind of this interactive thing where she sets it up. And then the next phase of the thing is to ask people to just raise their hands and keep it raised. And she asks a series of questions. And you'll notice that these questions are they're asking questions about programs that many people with disabilities and families use, but there are certainly other aspects of Medicaid that if you're a person who works with a lot of older adults, say, maybe senior care is an important benefit, you can switch up these questions to reflect the population you're working with. And I think you're going to get the same results. The video that she shared was a big outdoor rally. There was probably a couple hundred people there. And by the end of the questions, I think most people's hands were raised. So, that's an important thing to know, that there are that many people in the state who are, know somebody who is attached to one of these things that is partially or fully supported by Medicaid. All right, so what's Congress doing? Now we're going to start by talking about the reconciliation bill, which is moving now. Last week, you might remember the Senate passed and the House agreed to a budget resolution that's kind of the framework. So we are in a place where we're now able to start the reconciliation process. There is a second piece of legislation that we will briefly talk about that is another pathway to cuts, and that's called a rescission bill. So we're going to start with the reconciliation bill, which is the bill that we've been following since January, and then add on. Again, just a little bit of, ray of sunshine, because that's what I'm known for on Fridays these days. I want to start by saying, to get to this point in 2017, which was the last time we had during the first Trump administration, and we had an attempt not only to repeal the Affordable Care Act, but also to impose per capita caps on Medicaid, which is one of the ideas that Congress is still thinking about. It took just 10 days for the Senate and the House to agree on a budget framework and start the reconciliation process. 10 days. This time, it took them 99 days. And most of that delay is because of the volume of people in this state and across the country who have been calling them and specifically concerned about Medicaid. So look at the amount of time that you have bought to get a solid foundation for the next few weeks that are going to be critically important. You are doing a great job of making this hard, and making this hard is going to be key to avoiding cuts that are going to mean a lot less Medicaid dollars to states and a lot of real problems for state budgets and the bad decisions that states will end up having to make. Again, when you push back, they start stepping back. This timeline, even this morning, I need to learn to not open my email on Friday mornings before this presentation because there's always like a flood of like 4 or 5 things that come across my my screen that I'm like, I should add that to the presentation. Here's where we are. So Congress is in district this week and next week. And so next week is a critical, again, a critical week for getting in touch with Congress, making, making drop-bys and visits and connections with Congress. That's the last week, next week, before I think we're going to start to see things moving forward more quickly. The House, U.S. House of Representatives, is actually using, some of those committees are using this 2-week break time, and the first week is now over, to start writing the legislative language that is necessary. They're actually writing the bill at this point, putting pen to paper and drafting what are the cuts and, what's the language you were using to describe them. It looks like the week of April 28th, the committees that have increases, which is the Department of the committee that oversees like the Department of Justice and the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security, those committees that have uppers, increased spending, are going to be revealing what it is that they want to increase, use that money for. And then the next couple of weeks, we're going to see other committees start coming forward with cuts, their proposals. The week of May 5th, I think the Agriculture Committee, which oversees SNAP, and Transportation, which oversees public transit, they're kind of being foreshadowed as being 2 committees that may, reveal, they have their budget markup session, so we should get some idea of what they're proposing. May 9th is the kind of deadline without, it's a deadline, but it's not like a firm deadline. May 9th was supposed to be when all committees kind of got their cuts together. The Energy and Commerce Committee in the House is the one that oversees Medicaid. And they're already saying, well, we may not make May 9th, we may reveal what we're doing May 12th. Okay, so you've already bought a little more time and a little more delay. We're going to talk about in a minute some of the language that's starting to be used and what it might mean and what questions, hard questions you can start asking. We've talked about this before. There is now an incentive, as much delay as we have built in, which means there's disagreement, which means there's more time for us to try and influence. Congress now sees that some of these cuts are not popular, especially Medicaid cuts. So they have an incentive to put pen to paper, keep it kind of behind closed doors as long as possible, and then move really fast to pass something before people kind of know what's in it. So this is a really important period here, the next week or two, like next week when Congress is in district and before the Energy and Commerce Committee has its budget markup, to really start asking some very pointed questions when you hear lawmakers make assurances or promise things, to really get at, well, what are, how specific are your promises, and what do they actually mean? And remember, even when the committees kind of reveal and have their markup session, that becomes another point of action for folks. So nothing is done until it's signed by the president, and we are a long way from that. So right now we're in an influence period before anything comes out. There will be the reveal to understand what the proposals are and a response to those proposals that can change what those proposals are, okay? Now, already there is some instability, maybe is the right word. Congress knows if they don't move this reconciliation bill very quickly and have every Republican member, because if they want to pass the bill with only Republican members, and there has been no indication that any Democrats will support a reconciliation bill given the proposals that are being discussed. If they don't get this done relatively quickly, it may not move forward at all. Again, you guys, kind of asking the right questions, raising the right points, keeping at it, being persistent. The longer we slow things down, the more sand is in the gears, the harder it gets to move something forward. So when you have an article from a national nerd publication like Politico saying, hey, this isn't a done deal, this is far from certain, I think that you should look at that as a sign that there is the opportunity to influence. And notice that Medicaid cuts are one of the biggest sticking points in this bill. You made that the case. I kind of covered this. The thing about the House going first, the U.S. House had the language that the House gave to its committees, its instructions for, first of all, the amount of cuts, and the specific committees that were assigned those high numbers of minimum cuts, actually tells us a lot more about the direction of where they're thinking. So, and the House is more fiscally conservative. So the House going first is actually a good sign for advocates, because I think it will give us maybe a clearer picture of, the people who want to cut the most deeply and who are most willing to do a variety of ways to achieve that goal are going to be revealing what their proposals are first. Whereas the Senate will sit back and then see what the reaction is to the House's proposal before it starts its work. So again, we have this period to influence, then the committees come out and we will react to what the committees are proposing. Then the House has to get together and really agree to, they can make changes to what their committees have proposed into a final bill. And then we have another opportunity to really, push back and say, hey, these things are unacceptable. And the Senate is going to be watching all of that, and they're going to be watching it pretty closely. So it's a good sign for us that we have lots of opportunity to keep raising issues and raising concerns and demonstrating that some of these proposals are not popular. We spent a lot of time talking about Medicaid in the early portions of this webinars. Just a reminder that many committees have been assigned, cuts to do, and these are some of the other programs that are really at risk. And we'll talk a little bit more about developments that happened yesterday, but I do think that there are some clear signs that some of these issues are really going to be targeted. And if it's not in the reconciliation bill, it could be in a rescissions bill, or it could be in the next presidential budget, that there's a clear sign of intent that these kinds of programs are not the priority, and in fact may be defunded entirely. So I've used the term rescissions. It was a new word for me. Rescissions bill a couple of times. Here's what it is. This is a separate piece of legislation likely to maybe occur in the same time frame as the reconciliation bill. So we got two R words for two things that are happening at the same time. And what a rescissions bill is a proposal from the Trump administration that basically asks Congress to adjust or edit spending that they've already approved. And the Trump administration this week said, hey, we are planning to ask you to do this. And they named a figure in the press. We want to cut $9.3 billion from what we've already doing. So the important part about the rescissions bill is it can do really three things, right? It can remove all of the cuts that DOJ has been making kind of outside of the executive branch. Many people believe that this rescissions bill will be an ask to Congress to make those cuts okay, to kind of formally approve them after the fact. So a lot of the federal staffing cuts or cuts to programs or cuts to grants that have happened, probably in violation of Congress's appropriation authority. And there are obviously ongoing lawsuits about many of those actions. They're asking for Congress to say it's okay kind of after the fact. The other thing a rescissions bill might do is ask Congress to claw back or take back money from states that's already been appropriated. And we've seen some signs that this is a desire for the department to or for the administration to kind of take back money from laws like the infrastructure laws or grants or things that were approved under the COVID legislation from some years ago that haven't been fully spent, and say, okay, we know we gave you that money, but we're going to take it back. The other thing a rescissions bill can do is impact future spending, including things that were maybe approved to be funded in the continuing resolution that passed on March 14th. So the rescissions bill could make different decisions about continuing things that are currently funded that Congress said should be funded a month ago, for example, including disability programs. So the timeline that we are aware of now is that the rescissions bill might be coming as early as the week of April 28th. So again, not during this next week when Congress is in district, but the week after. Important time frame to start asking questions about, what are you doing outside of the reconciliation, and wanting to know what the content is of that. There are some big pieces, some things like the elimination of an agency called USAID, elimination of public broadcasting funding, and funding for the National Public Radio that have been in press articles as being things that are expected to be part of that rescissions bill. But there are lots of other cuts that have already happened, or lots of other intent to cut that is, kind of in the pipeline that could become part of that bill. All right, so we're going to go and talk about some of what Congress is saying now. Last week, I went through how unpopular Medicaid cuts actually are, especially amongst people who voted for the current administration. There was some recent polling that was done that really showed that most people do not support big cuts to Medicaid. And I think that some of the language we're starting to see is a recognition from Congress that people don't like the Medicaid cuts that they are proposing. And so they've kind of got some options. Their options are to convince people that cuts aren't cuts, or that they won't impact them, or we're going to try and, hide, policy changes that may result in loss of coverage so that people don't think they're cuts. Notice that something that is not on this does not do cuts. We, as our national advocates, have been really talking about, like, you should not be cutting Medicaid at all. But we have not gotten that message back from Congress. There is no one in Congress that is saying, yeah, I don't think I want to cut Medicaid. There are a few people saying, I don't want to vote for a bill that has Medicaid cuts in it, but you're going to see that some of the language they're using gives them a little bit of wiggle room to actually approve policies that we know would lead to people losing coverage in Medicaid, and essentially be a cut to the program. So a couple of slides here. What is a Medicaid cut? I think people who are familiar with Medicaid as it is now need to think about what you are familiar with and know now. Does it necessarily mean that's what it looks like after the passage of this bill? So if you're eligible now and you end up not being eligible after this bill passes, that is a Medicaid cut, because people who were receiving benefits are no longer eligible to receive them. If you're a small business who is now being paid for providing health or long-term care to participants, if it's harder for you to get paid, if it takes longer, if you don't know that you're getting paid, if you have to decide to serve fewer Medicaid participants or stop serving Medicaid participants, those are Medicaid cuts, because it directly impacts the capacity to provide care, and it directly impacts the number of small businesses that are able to provide that care, which means somebody who's in Medicaid as a program isn't getting the services that the program authorizes. And the Medicaid eligibility bill that many of you were watching from at the state level, if there's more paperwork more often with less room for errors, that either results in the delay of getting coverage or keeps people from being covered or causes people to lose coverage, that's a Medicaid cut. And we talked about eligibility, paperwork in the bill that we saw in the state legislature. The same mechanism is also how work requirements save money in Medicaid. These things save money in Medicaid because fewer people are able to complete the process and they lose their coverage. And work requirements, even if there are exemptions, you have to prove that you're exempt or that you have to prove that you're working. So very much the same mechanism of, if you add an administrative process that ends up being a barrier for folks and people lose coverage, that's a way that you're cutting Medicaid. If there are benefits that are required now under federal law that become optional, that's a Medicaid cut, because it means states don't have to do the same thing today as they would tomorrow. And if you have people who are qualified to be on Medicaid, they meet all the income, asset, functional screen, all of whatever the requirements are to be in a Medicaid program, but they have to wait. Thinking about the wait lists that we were familiar with from 10 years ago, and that are really a part of the existence of people in most other states across the country. Most states have waiting lists, like you can need care and not be able to get it. Some of those waiting lists are decades long in other states, especially for home and community-based care. If you're fully qualified to be in the program and you can't get the care authorized by the program because you have to wait for it, that's a Medicaid cut. All right, so I pulled some quotes from this article this week. This is Speaker Johnson, who's the leader of the U.S. House, and he and a couple other Republican members of the House of Representatives were quoted in this article, had a lot of things to say about who should be in Medicaid, and trying to talk about how they weren't supportive of Medicaid cuts, but right. So I'm going to pull some of the quotes and kind of highlight some of the language and the questions that you might want to consider asking if you hear this from your congressional representatives, or maybe you don't hear from them, but you want to ask them questions anyway. So the first quote: government must eliminate people on Medicaid who are not eligible to be there. we've had a lot of experience talking recently in Wisconsin about eligibility for Medicaid. And it's unclear who they mean by not eligible. Does that mean, who do they think is in the program now who shouldn't be? And the questions that we have on this slide are designed to kind of tease out the question. So if you're talking about actively saying that there are some people in Medicaid who we do not want to be in there, I think it's reasonable to ask, who are those people? Everybody who is in Medicaid now in Wisconsin is eligible to be there. They have had their income and their assets and, and other criteria checked and verified, and to be able to be in Medicaid program. And if you are renewing your application, that same process happens every year. So there aren't people who are not eligible to be in Wisconsin's Medicaid program. Everybody who is legally eligible to be in a Medicaid program is there if they apply and they make it through those checks. I think the other piece is, many advocates have wondered, are you going to change who is eligible to be in the Medicaid program? It's an easy statement to say, we need to, make sure that only the people who are eligible to be in Medicaid can be in Medicaid, but who's eligible is a definitional thing, right? And you could change the definition. And I think it's time to start asking those questions. Just a little bit of information for you in case you are contacting Congress. We've been in contact with our Wisconsin DHS, and they've been very helpful, and have said, hey, we don't have this problem of people who are not eligible for Medicaid being in the program. So you can say to our members of Congress, this is how it works. And you can also share your experience, which is what many people did when they testified at the recent state hearing on the Medicaid eligibility bill, to really illustrate, like, this is not an issue in Wisconsin. This is not something where you're going to get a lot of savings if you check more often, except that people won't be able to make it through the process and they'll lose coverage, right? We don't have a group of people in this state who shouldn't be there and is somehow hiding, that if we just looked harder, then we'd find them and remove them from the program. The only people who are in Medicaid in Wisconsin are people who are eligible to be there. So if we have people fall off because they can't meet new administrative requirements, we're just removing people who are eligible to be in the program. Another quote, we're starting to hear this phrase, people who are legally beneficiaries of those programs of Medicaid. And I think there's kind of two flavors to this phrase, legal beneficiaries. We've heard that some people are reporting, members of Congress are kind of claiming that there are illegal immigrants in Medicaid, or non-citizens, or people who have a different legal status than citizen who are in Medicaid. That's kind of one flavor of legal beneficiaries. There's also the question of, well, we know who it has to be covered under Medicaid now, under federal law. Are you going to change who has to legally be covered under Medicaid under federal law? And that has been a question that some national advocates have kind of had in the back of their mind for several months. So when you see the frame legal beneficiary, it's time to start asking the question of, okay, do you mean the same group of people that are legal beneficiaries now? Like you're not, like everybody who is required to be covered under federal law remains required to be covered. That's the beneficiary. You're not making some of those people optional states to cover. And the other piece is, again, a response of, there aren't people in Medicaid, at least in Wisconsin, that shouldn't be there. Kaiser Health News just came out with yet another fact sheet about that particular issue of, who is able to be in Medicaid, and that it's already true that federal Medicaid funds can't be used to cover undocumented immigrants. And there's a very narrow, everybody's status is checked before they get into Medicaid, and there's a very narrow exemption for certain people who have different statuses to receive some coverage. It's really a program that's limited to U.S. citizens and a narrow group of lawfully present immigrants. So if you needed a fact sheet, there it is. Lots of us have been hearing the phrase fraud, waste, and abuse for a long time. Again, actually eligible and now able-bodied workers. We'll get into the fraud, waste, and abuse piece in a little bit, which we've covered before in other sessions. I mean, I think that we're now at the point where some of our grassroots folks are starting to think about framing, what is your evidence for fraud, and trying to elicit from Congress what that is. Oftentimes the response is an improper payment amount, but improper payments aren't fraud. Improper payments are the vast majority paperwork mistakes. So, asking for what the evidence is and then having that response and being able to respond again is helpful. It's also helpful to hear what amount of fraud they think is in Medicaid, because the numbers that are being thrown around aren't really tied to anything that we can find as solid evidence. Fraud is a criminal activity. It is prosecutable. If you commit fraud, that is a crime. Waste or abuse is in the eye of the beholder. So even though this three-word phrase, fraud, waste, and abuse, fraud's the first word, and the implication is there's most of what they're talking about with fraud, waste, and abuse is fraud, but those other two words are now becoming important too, because what a member of Congress thinks is a waste or abusive, money that shouldn't be spent may in fact be perfectly not only legal, but a good thing to spend money on, Medicaid dollars on. And I think that, again, thinking about the hearing on the Medicaid eligibility bill, some of the expenditures that somebody who is not a part of Medicaid might think is wasteful might make perfect sense to an older adult who really needs grab bars or a ramp, for example, or a fencing because they have a young child who maybe has autism and is a runner. Like, some of these expenses might look funny to somebody who doesn't know the details of the case, but they also might be directly related to the health and safety of the Medicaid participant and be perfectly, common sense from that perspective. Able-bodied is another definition. I will tell you, on a meeting on 12 noon Central Standard Time, because things are changing so fast, I feel like I have to do the timestamp. The national advocates were saying there's a lot of discussion about work requirements, and they had seen some amounts of ideas floating around. The word they used was draconian. So all of the questions on here, it's really important when you think about work requirements to start digging a little deeper into the details. What is working age? They said, there's discussion from making that everything from 18 to 67, 18 to 65, that range of what do we consider working age becomes really important, because if you're implementing work requirements and you're looking at that as a cost saving strategy, then it makes sense that you would want to make the work requirements apply to as many people as possible, and you would want the exemptions to cover as few people as possible. So these kinds of questions about who are you thinking about as able-bodied, who does that include, who does it exclude, are going to be really important. And you can start asking those questions now and be prepared that when we see proposals from Congress, that you will have to ask those questions much more specifically. So a number of folks, grassroots folks, really thought about how to talk about fraud, waste, and abuse, and partly in response to the Medicaid hearing, there was one person who testified who started her testimony by saying, "My name is, and I am a Medicaid fraud suspect." And then kind of went on to talk about all of the things that she does when she is renewing her daughter's Medicaid renewal to prove that she is not a fraudster. And so number of people saw that and started thinking about, well, is this a way to flip the script? And I think it might be useful. So, you really do have the lived experience of, here's what I need to do to prove to the state that I am, eligible. I am a person who is not trying to take things from a system that I am not qualified to be in. Some of the other things that folks said at the hearing, they quantified the amount of time to do it. I had a conversation with a reporter and a couple of legislators. There was one woman who came who was like, here's how much time this takes me every year. And she brought a ream of paper with her and said, here is a 500-sheet ream of paper, and it takes me 3 of these to do the paperwork I need to renew my Medicaid, which is a really interesting visual. But a lot of people were really impacted by, okay, this person is tracking how many hours it takes to do this. There were also people at that hearing that said, this stuff is already too complicated for me. I need help to do it. I need help to understand the paperwork, or my disability really doesn't allow me to be able to navigate this process myself. We had one person say, hey, I am not a person that can use my hands, to write. So, I mean, I'm perfectly capable of telling you all the information, but if you get rid of pre-populated forms, that's actually really helpful to me, because otherwise I'd have to have somebody else, fill them out for me. And there were a couple other folks that really talked about, I think in a very smart and positive way, recognizing a need for the state to balance how hard is it to be able to get into the program with the desire to make sure that everybody in the program is qualified to be there. And a lot of, a couple of people said, hey, I want you to know how important Medicaid is. I'm doing the work because I recognize what that you don't want to give these things to people who aren't qualified, and how valuable I do this work because Medicaid is really valuable to me. And by the way, I'm a taxpayer too. So, I get that you want to make sure as a taxpayer that other taxpayers are paying for services that the folks in the program are entitled to. I think the same thing can happen with folks who are asking, who provide health or long-term care for Medicaid recipients. Again, flip the script on fraud, waste, and abuse. Every time you're submitting a reimbursement request, you really have to prove that that work meets the criteria. It's a service that is authorized under Medicaid, that you've done the service, that you've documented the service has been done. There's a tremendous amount of process and real consequences if you don't get it right. So I think that message of, we want to get this right because we value the program. We don't want it to be, overly costly. We want it to work well. We understand why we're doing this, but please recognize, like, this is all of the things that we already do is important. And I think it's important that businesses be real clear about the consequences of getting it wrong. Like, it's not only that you want to do a good job and get the paperwork right the first time, it's if you don't get the paperwork right, then your reimbursement is delayed or it's denied. And that has a real impact on the operation of your business. And if you really get it wrong, you can be investigated and audited, and there are real consequences for your business if you're audited and they find something that isn't quite right. Money can be clawed back. It could mean the end of your business. And I think that's a really important way to talk about, what is already required and why we don't have high rates of fraud in Medicaid. We've gone through this before. For those of you who have been attending these webinars, think of these slides as things to refer to when you're making your calls. Oops. Yet another article, we've had a lot of conversation about how work requirements really don't, encourage people who are not working to get jobs. And that is because so many people in Medicaid are already working. About 2/3, this is a national number, of people who are in Medicaid working age, as we define working age now, are already working. And a good proportion of the folks that aren't working would be in categories where they'd be exempt. Maybe they're already caregivers, or they have a disability or an illness that really makes it hard to participate in the workforce. So when Congress is talking about implementing work requirements, there just isn't that big of a volume of people in Medicaid to who aren't working that would get jobs out of that. And most of the time when there's work requirements, there's also not support or help to get people who aren't working into the workforce. So just yet one more article by our friends at Kaiser Health News, that, when we see work requirements, what really is happening is not encouraging a greater proportion of people to get into the workforce. It's really requiring a lot more paperwork that's going to take people off of Medicaid. And most of those people are already working. We're also starting to see some rhetoric about that kind of pitting people who are in Medicaid against each other. So we have this idea that's being talked about in this quote of certain individuals who are draining resources and somehow taking it away from people who actually need it, who are intended to receive it, the people with the real disabilities. And I think these are all really great pieces of rhetoric to ask some questions on. I don't know what it means to, who is taking away, right? Is it the children who are in Medicaid? Because that's mostly who's in Medicaid. And who are they taking it from? Or is everybody in Medicaid because they need it and it just serves lots of different populations of people that maybe don't look exactly the same, right? I also think it's an interesting question to pose to your members of Congress. Like, how are they thinking about evaluating who needs Medicaid? If you're making a comment that somehow the amount of care that you need should determine whether you get it, that may mean there are an awful lot of people in Medicaid who need help, who might not, come up to the threshold of help that a member of Congress has in their mind as being the standard for, the hurdle you have to go over to get into Medicaid. These kinds of questions become really important. And we've seen in other states where sometimes they really do make a decision of, well, if you have high care needs, you may not get in because we've got a group of people who has even higher care needs, and that's the amount we can afford to serve. So, is there a number they have in mind? How many people need Medicaid? How many people are you going to decide don't need Medicaid? Who are those people, and what are the characteristics? Because I think we have an idea in mind of we know who's in Medicaid now, and we kind of think about those same people should be in Medicaid in the future. But that isn't what this rhetoric is saying. That rhetoric is saying, who actually needs it? So need is a subjective word that you evaluate, and what one person thinks needs Medicaid may not be the same as another. I think it's interesting to hear the phrase intended to receive it. Medicaid has changed since 1965. It does serve more people than it used to in the beginning of the program. Medicaid has always been something where there has been an expansion, kind of like civil rights, where, oh, it makes sense to serve people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in Medicaid in 1965, but there are also, and older adults, but it also makes sense to serve other people who have sort of the same needs, and it makes sense to serve children and other populations. So Medicaid has always been becoming more inclusive up to this point. And I don't know what point in time when they said who's intended to receive it that they want to go back to, and who was in Medicaid at that time. So, you know, if you want to understand who is intended to receive Medicaid, I don't know who those people are. And I think it's important to ask those questions. People with the real disabilities, I don't know what that means. Who is part of the people with disabilities? What disabilities are considered real or not real? There's been some recent rhetoric that I think some non-visible disabilities, especially mental health, have kind of been not perceived as real as some physical disabilities or disabilities you can see. I think that's an important question to pick at, because again, there's a big population of people with disabilities, and disability looks like a lot of different things. So if there is some narrower version of what we think of as being disabled enough for Medicaid, that means there are a lot of people who need a little help or support that may not end up in that definition. We have a couple more articles on Medicaid and impacting family caregivers. That's another big population of people who ends up in Medicaid. Some of them are paid caregivers, but a lot of them are family caregivers who have taken themselves out of the workforce to, you know, supplement or provide care for another person. It is unclear whether those folks would be part of a work requirement exemption. And I think that's important to keep an eye on, because, you know, as you're thinking about who's available to help, if you're going to reduce the amount of time or that somebody can help because you're expecting them to be doing other things, or you're causing somebody to lose their coverage and do work and be uninsured, those are important questions to pull at. There's a lot of discussion also of we don't want to cut benefits. Well, I think it's important to ask questions about that, because Medicaid, like people in Medicaid don't receive a check. It is not like Social Security. They have a care plan if you're in long-term care, or a set of benefits that the state has said these are the things that we cover in Medicaid. And you don't get those benefits unless you actually need the care. So it's not like you have a benefit buffet that you can just go in and, you know, take as much as you want of anything that's offered. Like there's again a whole process of accessing care, making sure it's something that is covered by Medicaid, and reimbursing after the care is done. It's a pretty rigid process. So it's unclear to me what they mean by benefits. Do they mean we don't want to make such deep cuts that states have to reconsider what benefits are or aren't offered? Do they mean we know that there are certain mandatory benefits under federal law and some things that are optional, and maybe we're going to make some things that are required, that we require states to do? not required anymore. I mean, if you change what benefits states have to provide, that's a way to make Medicaid cover less, save Medicaid dollars, and also not cut into people's benefits. You've just changed the benefits that they can receive. And not stripping benefits really is silent about, okay, people who are in Medicaid who can access that benefit plan, we don't want to change the benefit plan. That is not the same as if we make it harder to get in or stay in Medicaid, you do lose your benefits if you lose your coverage. So, I think there's some questions there for people to start asking. Do you really mean that everybody who is in Medicaid now will get exactly the same thing that they have now? Are you going to make it harder for people to get in? Because if they lose their coverage, then they're not getting benefits. I don't know what traditional Medicaid services needs. Again, that idea of what are states required to cover now? What is optional? Are you going to change what's on those lists, right? What does it mean to go back to traditional? What point in time are we moving to? What was covered at that time? Those are important questions. And I think we are starting to hear the phrase vulnerable population, but there is absolutely no indication of who's in that population. I think we all have an idea in our heads of who we think should be included in that kind of definition, but it's important for us not to assume that what we're thinking of and what we think, of course, these are the people who should be vulnerable. I think it's time for Congress to itemize who's in and who's not. Because there's probably a lot of people we think should be in a definition of vulnerable who maybe Congress, especially in a mode where they're looking to control or reduce Medicaid costs, might not think should be included in that population. An article came out this week that really underscores something we've been talking about since January, that shows that when states have had various economic downturns, that Medicaid has been a place that they've looked to cut, and that every state has reacted to those things by looking at the optional home and community-based service package, which in our state is Family Care, IRIS, and CLTS. And states have used a number of strategies to kind of drive down the spending in that area. A lot of them have used waiting lists. So some of this isn't necessarily new news, but it is a new article by serious health nerds at the national level that is pointing out there is a relationship that when you reduce Medicaid spending or you have stress on a state budget, these are the programs that often get hit first, and that hitting those programs and reducing spending in the low cost, home and community-based services ends up causing increased nursing home stays and more spending on the institutional side. Oops. Just a reminder, when I'm talking about what are states required to cover under federal Medicaid law, here's the list of mandatory services. And then I've included some of the things that are optional under federal Medicaid law. I've highlighted home and community-based services, but other things like prescription drugs and things that people find valuable and use all the time, and that I think all would say are important to overall health, are actually in the optional category. If you want, you can go online to the Department of Health and Human Services. I went on yesterday, it's still up. And you can get the entire list of 57 optional services. Wisconsin does cover I think all of them. So, when you're thinking about what are states' options, you can see that if the federal government starts saying, well, states, we're going to move more things from the mandatory category to optional under federal law, that provides a pathway for states to make cuts. And if they don't do any changes, you can see that the things that states don't have to do there's a lot more pressure to look for savings there. If you have big federal spending cuts that end up causing state budget shortfalls and really big decisions for states. If you're looking for a fact sheet, because I know a lot of you like them, here is a great resource for you. There's all sorts of stuff. Many of these are things that we've covered in previous webinars, and there's all sorts of stuff that's on there. So you'll get this link in the notes. So we're going to see things start to accelerate. In 2 weeks, prepare all the action that you've been taking, that you're all taking this week, next week, all that stuff, all really important. But in 2 weeks, we're going to have to put our foot on the gas because I think things will start to move a lot faster. We will need to have a rapid response as we learn what is in these various what these various committees are proposing to do. And then once we've kind of responded, we will have to continue to have a response throughout this period. So remember that we've already had a delay of 99 days before we got to the point where the reconciliation bill started. From this point on, every day that advocates stretch this out is another day that Medicaid, as we know it now, stays the same, and that we can make the case that it should stay the same. So we have a real role here where our active work can really change what lawmakers decide they will and won't do. We're going to move now to away from Congress, away from the reconciliation bill, away from the rescissions bill, and talk a little bit about what has been happening within federal agencies and kind of some of the larger administration policies that may have some impact on people with disabilities and even Medicaid. So once again, a refresher. Federal government collects revenue, largely from income taxes. Congress is supposed to decide how to spend that revenue. It assigns federal agencies to do that. And oftentimes the appropriations Congress makes go to agencies that then direct money to states, and that money trickles down into the programs that you know and love, like Family Care Iris, other things. So we pay in our taxes, and it kind of comes back to us in state services that we all use, including Medicaid, but also lots of other work that you may not realize has a funding footprint from the federal government. There are a lot of things that are potentially going to reduce the amount of money that the federal government has to spend. So in a moment where Congress is thinking about cutting, I think, $4.5 trillion in order to extend the 2017 tax cuts and try and make a dent in the deficit. And if you included all of the tax cuts, it might be closer to $5.5 billion. We are also at the same time seeing some things that will reduce the amount of money coming in. Well, if you have less money coming in, and you're also trying to cut by a certain number, you kind of have to cut more if you're going to get to the same savings level. IRS this week, there's indications that they're planning to lay off 40% of the workforce. IRS is the main revenue collector, and their economists are warning that that means there will be hundreds of billions less revenue collected. That's actually really important because remember, when we were talking about the reconciliation bill, part of what Congress has to do is raise the debt ceiling. And the debt ceiling is basically our country paying its bills, what it owes. And if you don't pay what you owe, you default, which means people don't want to do business with you as much anymore if you don't pay them back after they've kind of given you use of their money. So many folks have been seeing the deadline for the debt ceiling, that date in which the US government can't pay its bills anymore, as the default date for when Congress has to get the reconciliation bill done. Right now, it looks like we will run out of money and reach the debt ceiling by August of September. But many advocates are starting to point out, if you start reducing the amount of revenue that the government's collecting by hundreds of billions of dollars, for example, that deadline of when does the United States not have the ability to pay its bills moves up. So some of the things that are impacting revenue here may in fact put more pressure on Congress to do things faster, because we're collecting so much less revenue that we're going to reach the debt ceiling faster. So staffing cuts at IRS are actually a big deal. Tariff impacts are a big deal. For a lot of small businesses, there's the impact on individual people, especially on people with lower fixed incomes. As their prices go up and their income doesn't, that becomes not sustainable, and for some people really fast, and for a lot of people who are in Medicaid, which is a program that requires poverty, you don't have a lot of flexibility in your budget to absorb increased costs. But there's also an impact on small businesses, and sometimes that may mean that the costs that they have gone so high that they go out of business, which means job losses, or it may mean that they have to figure out a different way to keep running, but they may also not expand or not do certain things that they were planning to do because they're uncertain about whether their costs of doing business will continue to go up. And that impacts how much taxes. When people lose jobs, they lose their income and they can't pay income taxes. When businesses don't expand and don't create more jobs, there's less economic activity. We've already seen a lot of people within the federal workforce, and the federal workforce is spread across the whole country, lose their jobs. Maybe some of them have gotten other jobs, but not everybody. And it's certainly a destabilizing event in people's lives to lose a job. They don't usually get, they don't move from being fired or laid off one day to having a different job the next day. And it may not be a job that pays the same amount. So again, when you think about income taxes and revenue, all of that instability of people's employment situation changing is impactful when it comes to revenue. And then, of course, there are lots of federal funding cuts to programs and grants that ultimately impact and have a ripple effect in all states. Much of that federal money is coming to pay people. It's coming to pay people who do things at the county level, maybe in a nonprofit that's close to your community, maybe a state agency who's doing various things, lots of that, or a researcher at a university. Lots of that federal money is actually coming into states and it's supporting workers. So when those things go away and that money goes away, a lot of times those jobs go away too. One thing on tariffs, it is unclear where the tariff policy is going. We have a 10% across the board tariff on most countries now. On China, it's significantly higher. And there is indications this week that the administration may be preparing to put some tariffs on pharmaceutical items, drugs. Important to know that the cheap drugs, the generic drugs, are not made in this country. They are imported. So, when you think about the impact of tariffs, one impact is possibly more expensive drug prices, either because we have to source it from places that are more expensive to begin with, or the amount of tariff on the cheaper generic drugs starts to increase those prices. Medicare and Medicaid spend a lot of money on prescription drugs. So at a time when you're looking at making at least pretty big cuts to Medicaid, one of the biggest cost drivers could go up for another reason and put even more pressure on states to figure out how to cover that or change what they do and don't cover with prescription drugs. There are also some immigration policies that are impacting the direct care workforce. Many of us have experienced for the last, I don't know how many years, there are not enough workers to really meet the needs of people who need home and community-based care, and frankly, care in residential care facilities like nursing homes and assisted living. Part of that is a lot of those workers are paid by Medicaid and their wages are pretty low and they don't necessarily have benefits. So this is a long and chronic issue that's been really important to people with disabilities and older adults for a long time. About a third of the workforce are immigrants. There are now starting to be some stories of people who are immigrants who are working in the home care industry who are being deported. There was a article in Madison. There's been a couple articles in the New York Times, and I think this is an impact of a policy that is being applied across the administration and an impact on people with disabilities. So again, something to watch as we go on. The U.S. Department of Health Services, there's been a lot happening in this week. Many of you may have seen the press conference, I believe it was Thursday, maybe it was Wednesday, where the Secretary of the Department of Health Services had a lot of comments specifically about autism, defining it as potentially a preventable disease, and made a lot of statements about what he felt were the limitations of people with autism, things that they would never do, which many of us realize are not true. He has since walked back. Again, when you push back, they step back. Now he's on the defensive and trying to say that he only meant to say that people with autism will never pay taxes or hold a job or write a poem or go on a date. That's kind of the quote that's been flowing around. He only meant that would apply to nonverbal autistic people. Again, also not true. He's trying to do a study and portraying autism as an epidemic, and most of the items that have been said in the press about what that study is trying to achieve is directly in conflict with the established medical community and people at the Centers for Disease Control. A lot of the rhetoric that has been floated around is, again, trying to link autism, the increased rates of autism to vaccines, parenting choices, lots of very old ideas that many of which have been formally disproven by multiple studies. I think the important thing to take away here is the language around people with disabilities, because I think that it is fairly clear there is a thought, a process that believes that people with disabilities are somehow less productive or less valuable or worth preventing. And that is very different than how do we help support, how do we help make people support people to be as independent and live their lives and value every person, no matter what we think their capability is or isn't. It's kind of up to the person to go as far as their capabilities allow. In addition to that, yesterday, there was a story leaked to the press that really that shows that the administration, at least in their 2026 budget proposal, intends to eliminate almost all of the organizations, including this one and Disability Rights and the University Centers for Excellence and many others that you may be familiar with, their work in the state that are essentially directly serving people with disabilities or older adults, or doing functions that are related to advocating for the needs of that population. Many people are worried that this language from the Office of Budget Management may be implemented far sooner than 2026, and they are looking at either the reconciliation or rescissions bill as potentially being two places where these kinds of cuts could be made. I will say that there is no wrong time to connect to Congress, and there is no, again, thinking about when you push back, they step back. It is not a bad idea right now to very clearly say, we do not think these are good ideas, if that's what you believe. The groups on this list, and there are lots of others, there are lots of other programs that were listed as being eliminated, as in like all of the funding, the specific funding to them being removed. A lot of these groups' role is to listen to people with disabilities and older adults, and what they do is to push systems and programs to work better for people, to be more efficient, more effective, to evolve, say, hey, here's what we need to change. And they're the people you call when things are going really wrong for you as an individual. So I think, between the press conference where the secretary of the department made some statements that really, really upset a good portion of the disability community, and then really the next day finding that there's a proposal to remove your voices from that, from being funded, I think is a strong signal of intent. And it's probably a good idea to make Congress aware of what you think about that. DHS just keeps doing things. This is actually really important. It's a nerd thing, but the federal poverty guidelines are the way that funding is calculated for lots and lots of different programs that require people to be below a certain income. It's a way that they calculate how much money and the formula grants that come to states. Medicaid is one of those programs, but it's far from the only one. And they just fired everybody who knows how to calculate that poverty level. It is unclear what that means, but there are certainly a lot of people who are really, really worried about it, because if the federal poverty level isn't adjusted to reflect increasing costs, it means that the income that you have to be qualified for the program stays the same as costs go up, and you have fewer and fewer people that end up being eligible for programs like Medicaid or food assistance or childcare support and many other services. It's actually a pretty long list of programs that use this particular metric to determine who is eligible, and use this particular metric to determine how much money states get for those programs. There's also been an announcement this week of an executive order that the president issued that lets administrative rules be repealed without public notice or comment. Sometimes Congress writes laws and agencies have to interpret what those laws mean, or they have to work out their details. Like, okay, Congress has said this, but how are we going to do it? And frequently, agencies will promulgate is the fancy word, but they will make rules that have the effect of law to say, okay, this is what Congress says, and this is how we're going to do it. And some of those administrative rules are really complex, and some of them are really narrowly focused on stuff, and some of them are pretty broad. And there are a lot of administrative rules that govern how Medicare and Medicaid work, how spending is allowed, what various entities are required or not required to do. They're pretty important. And there are a lot of national advocates that are very concerned that there are going to be administrative rules disappearing that might be pretty important to people with disabilities. Two that have been mentioned already are the nursing home minimum staffing rules, which just went into effect, like they were just finalized last year, and a Medicaid eligibility and enrollment administrative rule, which was designed to make it easier the enrollment process easier. It's telling states, hey, here's how you do things to make it easier for people to navigate the systems. So those are not the only two rules. There are a lot of rules that specifically the Department of Health and Human Services has about a lot of different things. Some of them are really closely related to people with disabilities. Some of them impact the programs that many people with disabilities and older adults use. And it is unclear how many of them will remain intact or just be removed. We also saw last week a memo come out from the Centers for Medicaid Services, and that's the part of the Department of Health and Services that specifically is paying attention to Medicaid. And many of our states have various programs that exist under what is called a waiver authority. So states can ask states have a lot of flexibility in terms of how to design their Medicaid programs. There's certain things they have to do in federal law, certain things they're allowed to do in federal law, and then many times states will say, okay, we would like to do something specific, and maybe they'll design a program like Badger Care or Family Care or IRIS or CLTS. And they'll ask the federal government for permission under a statutory authority to establish a program and try out different things. So when you hear about a waiver renewal, that is a process where we as a state are asking the federal government, hey, can we do it this way? Can we do it this way? And sometimes the federal government will say, well, yeah, you can, but you have to make these changes, or, that's a new idea, let's try it out. So every state uses waiver authority to basically come up with how they do Medicaid in their state. And no two states look alike. So, the programs that we talk about in Wisconsin that we understand to be Medicaid, other states have do things differently. They have maybe more waivers than we do. They have different program names, whatever. It's a mechanism for states to ask the federal government, here's how we would like to design and run our Medicaid programs. Last week, CMS sent out a letter that states using a certain kind of waiver authority, 1115, which is the same authority Badger Care uses, can't use the Medicaid dollars to pay for the same things that the waiver is allowing them to currently do. This memo would not impact Wisconsin, is our understanding from DHS. But I'm highlighting it because this is another mechanism that administratively can be used to make Medicaid cuts. Redefining what states can use Medicaid dollars for means that states that are doing something now that's okay, if they're told in the future it won't be okay, then whatever they're spending those dollars on doesn't have a funding source unless the state figures out a different source of money than Medicaid. So I think it's useful to know that, because yes, Congress is talking about Medicaid cuts, but there's a lot of things that administratively can also happen to either make it easier for states to reduce how much money they're spending on Medicaid, or force states to stop doing some things that Medicaid money is being spent on now, which again has the effect of reducing Medicaid spending overall, but also reducing what Medicaid actually does within a state. The U.S. Department of Education, little update here. This is a more recent article. They sent a letter April 1st to all states, and education agencies. In our state, that's Wisconsin DPI, to say, hey, you've got to certify that you're not using illegal DEI practices. And the Trump administration early on issued an executive order saying, hey, don't do these things anymore. Anything that's considered DEI is no longer allowable. You've got to stop doing that. So that the illegal phrase is really referring back to that executive order. They are giving states to until April 24th to certify, is the word that they're using, that they're not doing illegal DEI practices. If they want to continue, otherwise the penalty could be that they might lose access to federal education funding. And Title I funding was specifically mentioned. So the federal government has about a little over $18 billion that's distributed to states for Title I funding, and almost all school districts receive some of that money. A lot of states have signed that certification. Wisconsin has not yet. And the Department of Public Instruction has asked a bunch of follow-up questions, legal questions about, well, what do you want us to actually certify? What is that? What's the purpose of what you're asking? What does that certification mean? Like, are you looking for ways that we've certified something and then you're going to tell us that that's not true? Other questions like that. Trying to figure out what is it the department wants school districts to certify. It has not received, as of at least Monday. I actually today, because they would have sent out a notice if they had received questions. It hasn't received a response from the U.S. Department of Education about, what does this mean? And they do not have any assurance that there won't be actions taken on states that either haven't signed the certification or have signed a certification and then the U.S. Department has said, well, we actually think you're in violation of it and there might be a penalty with federal funding. There are still there are 3 sessions left. There are listening sessions that DPI is conducting to try, and they're trying educational sessions. They're trying to explain what's the relationship between federal funding. 2 of them are next week. One of them is virtual. So if you are interested in asking more questions to the Department of Public Instruction, there are some opportunities coming up. Social Security. Last week, the Social Security announced that they are now moving to X as their sole communication platform. We're almost done, I swear. A lot of people had some opinions about that. There are certainly a lot of people on in Social Security who don't have reliable access to technology or social media accounts, or maybe don't want a social media account on that particular platform for a variety of reasons. Again, this is another opportunity to raise questions with Congress. Certainly in the past, most government agencies have gone above and beyond to communicate as many mediums as possible, because their customer base is the public, and the public is kind of everywhere. So it makes sense that if you want to have a public message that you would want to broadly talk about it. This is a departure from that approach, and it really seems to require that people who want information about this agency have to only get it from one source. And I think that might be something people have opinions about that Congress could be interested in. This is an older policy change, but we're bringing it up again because it is a significant policy change. So, if you receive more money than you should from Social Security, now Social Security is going to say you need to pay it all back at once. If we did that. And that is a big change that can be pretty impactful to participants. So we want to make sure people know that. Again, this is a policy change the agency has made that is different from what they used to do before. And, we still are watching, people, there seem to be a lot of changes on what's being displayed on the portal. It is really unclear some of the technology changes that are happening in Social Security behind the scenes. So, the first week of April, there were folks who saw something real different than they had before. It looks like most people got the check for the right amount and on time, but it's something to be thinking about as we're mid-month and coming up to the 1st of May, that if you see anything that is different, it might be important to let somebody else know about it. All right, action steps. I'm going to blow through this. Really, stay the course. Everything you did this week, trying to meet with Congress and district. Remember, there's 2 joint finance hearings coming up, not next week, but the week after. All the things you're normally doing. These are all the things to keep doing, especially next week when Congress is in town. Some specific instructions for in-district work. Drop by an in-district office. Make your invites. See if you can get a cup of coffee next week. See if they'll come to your place of business or to your home. There's no penalty for, making an offer, even if it isn't necessarily responded to. Go to districts. Make sure you're bringing, something to leave behind. Leave your notes. Take your pictures. It's important to make sure that when Congress is home, they are actively seeing members of the public trying to engage with them, and that they are hearing some of the same concerns coming up to the top over and over again. I was in a joint finance meeting yesterday where the staffer was like, Medicaid is the thing that we are hearing the most about, and we know how popular family care is. That is the kind of thing you want to cement into people's heads. Not next week, but the week after, there are 2 joint finance hearings in Hayward and in Wausau, and Wisconsin Eye covers those, right? And they put out, here's what people were talking about. Notice that healthcare and education, which are 2 issues that we know people with disabilities and older adults and care a lot about, were the main 2 things that were talked about at those hearings. Let's see if we can make those circles even bigger on healthcare and education. Because most of the people who were talking about healthcare actually were talking about Medicaid. And a lot of those people were you. So, let's have a repeat performance on Monday, April 28th and Tuesday, the 29th. Okay, one other thing, there are people who, there's a lot of engagement and a lot of activity, especially in social media places, about issues that are important to people with disabilities. And it's just a reminder that when you have a post that people are really interested in, sometimes that attracts non-humans, bots, or just humans that really need other hobbies, to make comments that are designed to make people mad. And the more people engage with those bots or comments, the more they come, the more of them there are. The algorithm kind of drives that discontent. So it's important to remember, don't engage with comments where it looks like it's just a meme that's posted or it's something inflammatory. Let's teach AI not to be as rude. And not to know how to better say something that's going to provoke interaction. It's perfectly fine to share things on social media. You should. It's a way to disseminate information. And it's perfectly fine to have discussions with people you know, but just be aware that there are lots of accounts that aren't real people. And some of those accounts, their purpose for being is to, get people mad and take your time. Don't let them take your time. Reserve your time for the things that matter, like contacting Congress. Okay. So now we're in a stretch where we know things are going to accelerate. If you haven't contacted Congress before, if you haven't been a part of what has happened until now, there's time. This is the time that everybody needs to get engaged, and we need to get more people engaged. So if you are a provider or an employee who works with people with disabilities or older adults, or a person who has worked with county programs, the folks that you know, your clients, the people that you work with, your small business, if you haven't been engaged with Congress, the time is now, and into the future. So think about ways to broaden the network of people who are contacting Congress about Medicaid, about some of these other issues. The more noise you make, the more people will Congress will pay attention. When you push back, they step back. And we need everybody pushing right now to have them really think hard before they do anything, or to think hard and not do anything. Okay. The people who are having the most influence are people like you. That is just true right now. There's a lot of not listening to the folks that maybe you would have thought 5 years ago would have the most credibility. You are the ones that they are listening to. And I think, the last few weeks, there have been some real clear cause effects. You are the one who are causing the effect. And so I want to make sure people know that everybody who is doing the work and who has been doing the work, not only have you had a huge impact till now, you are going to be the reason why things either happen or don't. So the more people that get in that space and keep moving forward, the better we are. And I think we're starting to see some real shifts. All we need is a couple of Republicans in the House to really say nope and dig in their heels, and everything changes. So this is not impossible. And you are the reason why they're having heartburn and second thoughts. I'm going to stop sharing. I've gone over time. Are there any questions that have not been answered?